Welcome to the Relationship Toolbox, a show about the skills we need to build healthy relationships with others. Today we're going to discuss the second part of a two-part series on disinformation in our society and the impact it has on our relationships. So Marsha, let's start again with a quick review of what do we mean by disinformation?
Well, as we mentioned previously in our other episode, disinformation are statements that are made to mislead, to misinform others by creating falsehoods, discrediting verifiable information, or demeaning an opposing view. And the purpose for doing this seems to be for personal gain or the acquisition or retention of power and influence, greed, or sometimes just to escape accountability. So disinformation, we emphasized, was a deliberate act and rather than a passive act. However, disinformation can become misinformation if we are passively passing it on without examining it for its validity. So the two questions that we're going to look at today are, how do we detect information that is disinformation, and how do we respond, or how do we disarm it so that it doesn't have a destructive influence? So we'll be examining some of the components of critical thinking today in accomplishing these tasks.
So let's start with on the personal level,
Okay.
with our relationships. Spouse, children, colleagues at work, best friends, that type of thing. And another part I happened to think of this morning is dating sites, the online dating.
Yeah.
And
That's true.
when people are applying for jobs, it gets a personal thing. So the disinformation that might be in a resume. So let's look at what are some of the signs that we should be on the lookout for. In terms of a more personal relationship. First of all is the sort of the sense in our gut. Something doesn't seem quite right.
Yeah, we have that system to kind of, that limbic system again,
Yes.
like to protect us. There's, like I'm picking up senses. So
Yeah, the vibes are there, but we
Vibes are
can't
there.
quite put our finger on what it is. And then sometimes it's just finding contradictory evidence to what somebody has been saying to us. For example, if you gave permission to your teenage daughter to go on an overnight for the weekend, and then later in the week you're talking with the other parents or other child's parent, and you mention how it was so nice of them to invite your daughter over, and they say, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Your daughter wasn't at our house over the weekend. You go, boom, there's evidence that to show that you've been deceived. Sometimes we actually can see or hear something ourselves that lets us know, I know that isn't factual because I've been in that experience of something that tells us directly not true. Sometimes we can, if we're paying attention in sort of a self-awareness way, can begin to pick up on, we're starting to use denial. I don't think this person would ever say something like that if it weren't true, or they would never lie to me.
Because you want to believe that.
You want to believe
You really
it.
want to believe that you would not be treated that way.
Right, and that puts us in a vulnerable position where we can be deceived. Sometimes it comes in the form of actually our friends warning us that this person is not being honest with you.
Particularly in the dating situation, because
yes.
they can be objective and can see things that are suspicious, and the person who is reaching out just wants to be received well and belong and wants to be loved as much as possible, so they're blinded sometimes by the signs that other people see.
And then another indicator is when you ask questions about what statement the person has made, they deny it, or they turn around and attack you with all kinds of verbal attacks.
To some other topic.
Change the topic. So suddenly you find you're the one being questioned rather than someone just saying, oh, I can understand why you thought this, let me explain that, and it makes sense then.
Yeah, so we can get disinformation in our interpersonal relationships, at home with friends, romantically, employment-wise, but also this shows up on a societal level. And so we want to know what are the indicators that we might be receiving disinformation or distortion of the facts or outright falsehood. So some of the things that might be key indicators are that proponents of disinformation omit critical information that, if acknowledged, might make what is being said inaccurate. So they're selectively, they are reporting something that is in fact true, but it might be in the context of a bigger picture, but they're choosing to emphasize this and de-emphasize other things. They make statements that can't be backed up by evidence, either evidence that they're refusing to offer or evidence that you find if you're like laterally looking for other people saying the same thing. It's opinion-based. They might constantly repeat something that is false, but just by the frequency with which it is being said, it kind of starts to ring true because you've heard it. But that alone, just the frequency of it being offered, is not enough to accept it as a fact. And this can happen on an interpersonal scale as well as a societal scale. But if you draw conclusions solely based on your own experience, and you kind of generalize those experiences to a larger population, then that can also be a problem. And you're dismissing the expertise of others. Certainly you might have some personal gain, and it is maybe at the expense of the welfare or interest of others. A tendency to ridicule or demean opposing perspectives should be a red flag. I mean, we all have deep, passionate convictions about our positions, but you can still maintain a certain level of civil dialogue and mutual respect in expressing those things.
That's say you attack the person,
right,
for having that view.
Right. Sometimes people appeal solely to those emotions, and we've talked about the limbic brain again, and you are speaking to that lower brain stem where you're going to have a knee-jerk reaction based on an emotion, and not allowing the rational examination of something because it's just such a strong response. And then sometimes people just outright invalidate either scientific or academic or research that has previously been considered expertise, just because that, as a last resort, they're saying, well, you can't trust your sources. It's the kind of untransparent, extreme, passionate statements that you might want to examine.
So the antidote to this is sort of critical thinking.
Yeah, kind of a test.
Yes.
Like you poke at things.
What do we mean by critical thinking skills? What are we referring to as a means of detecting disinformation, but also keeping it from harming us or helping or creating poor decisions that we later regret and say, had I known this, I would never have done this action. So critical thinking is sort of a mindset. It's a deliberate act of or a commitment to analyzing what we're hearing by engaging logic, reasoning, self-awareness, and a sense of curiosity. And we do this through the form of questioning prior to drawing conclusions or making a judgment. You may wonder why we've got this question mark here in the beginning, right in front of us, which I'll put back here a little bit. But this is what we want you to keep in mind throughout this whole thing, that the critical thinking is based upon knowing how to ask questions. So we're going to take a look at this because as humans, we have a tendency to try to just naturally distort things to accommodate what we need.
And I think these days, maybe not on an interpersonal level, but on a societal level, we are being bombarded with such a volume and rapidity of information that it's hard. Sometimes we are just fatigued and we don't employ the rigor of examination of things just because it's like coming at us and it's the volume is just amazing.
So some of the ways that we distort for ourselves, we distort information. First of all, we say, I know it's true because it just feels right. Sometimes you can rely on your intuition, but you really should check that out against some type of factual backing up of that feeling. It's not a reliable source on its own generally to say, okay, I'm going to base my decision or my action on my feeling. Another way that we can deceive ourselves is to say, it's true, I know it's true because everyone else says it's true. So that gets into the if other people are saying it's true, well, it must be then, I'm going to go along with that. And again, it's not bothering to question even what other people are saying before I decide to join in and perpetuate this same understanding. Another one is it's true because I know it is. There's just no other explanation that will change my mind. And that's just plain closed thinking, the opposite of asking questions. And finally, it's true because I can't trust what other people are saying. They're liars. It's not what I think, so they're lying. And that can lead to another deception where we then don't begin to examine what we're being asked to accept.
Sometimes we double down because we've held a position or a perspective and we don't want to abandon it because we have invested so much energy and social currency or whatever in it that we almost have to protect that investment. It's kind of like a sunken investment.
Almost a part of our identity.
And so you just can't let go of it because it is wrapped up in who you are.
So when we allow ourselves to get into that deceptive thinking, these are often the results of that. We begin to view the world only from our own perspective and as our own, solving our own needs, our own self-interests. Or we distort reality to get what we want. We can also just disregard pertinent information that might change our perspective if we learned that information or if we opened ourselves up to a different point of view. And finally, when we allow deceptive thinking to take over, it can prioritize our own needs over the needs of others.
I think that we were ripe for kind of incubating this this posture during COVID because it was a time when we, in fact, did need to take care of ourselves.
And it cut us off from other people in many ways. We had to rely not on personal contact with people and hearing all the things that we've talked about in communication, tone of voice, body language, and also that helps us to determine the legitimacy or reliability of what someone's saying. We had to rely on medium again to do that. And it certainly did a job on our children.
And we were disconnected from community. So it really was a more insular, individualized approach to survival and day-to-day living and getting by.
Which we seem still to be experiencing to some extent, even though we're not worried about COVID necessarily.
But we're kind of cruising on the momentum of that really visceral experience, which kind of put us into ourselves. So let's just take a couple of examples that are out there in the universe
and that we can hear
and see if we could poke at it. We're looking at trying to be curious. We're trying to be scientists. Like, I want to poke at this to see if it's true, and here's this thing that's a hypothesis. And how do I know that this is true? And I think we have a couple of slides that are that we can.
So the first one is this one drives me crazy when I hear someone start to say this. So they make their statement and they say, well, everybody knows this. Well, how do we know everybody knows this? It sort of draws us into accepting something before we've even thought about it. A variation of that is, oh, I know you would agree with me when I say, and well, maybe I don't agree with you, but if I don't assert myself at that point and say, wait a minute, you just said I would agree with you and I don't, then it can carry its own weight. And finally, a statement that says, anyone who knows anything about this topic will tell you, implying that, well, if you don't know what I think I know, then there's something less valuable about your opinion or your understanding of this.
Right. So, those statements by themselves are not necessarily true, because they could be used to introduce things that are common understandings. But it's a little presumptive, and it generalizes and kind of sets you apart. If everybody is believing this, then what are the stakes for me personally? If I don't concur, I'm going to be kind of sidelined or isolated. We would also say, is this more of a point of view or a verifiable fact? If they go on to offer evidence, then great. But if they don't, then it is generalizing an opinion into a fact. Is there another perspective that might also be valid? Sometimes two things can be true at the same time.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And you don't necessarily need to say that one is true and the other is false, but that there are overlaps and they can be equally true. So, but yeah, when you say everyone, I feel like from an identity sense of belonging that, do I have the stamina to stand alone and not be part of that everybody? Yeah. So what's another question that has come up that we could use as an example?
Well, this is sort of just an example. I don't think, Marsha, I'm going to get another COVID shot. I heard that some people have actually caught COVID from getting the vaccine.
I actually sat next to somebody on a plane that held this position. And so let's go through some of the tests and then actually talk about the content of this statement. So who's making this statement and what is their purpose? Whenever you hear something, you do want to kind of know whether you're reading it, who's the author of this, and what is their agenda, what is their bias? Because we all have biases. What is their kind of spin on this? What's the source of this information? Where did you read it? Where did you hear it? And what was their source of information for making this claim? Is there anything missing in this statement that might change if that were included? How do I even check the validity of some of these things? Because you can't be an expert in everything. And we're going to talk about some places that you can go. Is the statement more a point of view? Is this an opinion that is then extrapolated and applied to a larger position? Or is this absolutely false? Haven't I heard some people dispute this, and what's that about? So let's just look at that. There are places that you can go to, and I've looked into this, and there are things that could be misconstrued. Evidently, the shot takes about 10 days to 2 weeks to become potent. And so you could have had a shot and then contracted it because it was within that 2-week period, either before or after.
Before the vaccine. Yeah.
Sometimes the symptoms feel like you've got the backlash of having taken the vaccination. And also, we had a surge of COVID around the same time that we were beginning to do the vaccination. So those two things could be conflated. I am not a scientist, but what I have researched and delved into, there isn't any evidence that I could find that there is a direct correlation. So, but people were afraid And then there were also policies.
So in making that decision personally about whether I should get a shot again, it'd be important to ask those questions that you were following up on and trying to get more information so that you don't deceive yourself.
And it's hard. It is really hard. And 10 years from now, when we do kind of a look back on this, maybe there'll be new information that we don't know. But in current information, there didn't seem to be any evidence. There also there were breakthroughs with different strains of the virus too that were not supported.
And the science was changing and growing, evolving
Yeah.
at the same time. Another thing that we hear frequently now is, I know this business about the immigration. The majority of immigrants coming into this country are really criminals, or they're uneducated, and they are overwhelming our schools and our social services.
Okay, so let's break this down. Again, there are some tiny kernels of truth in this.
Yeah.
That might have been amplified. Be careful when somebody says every or all or the majority and doesn't quantify those terms. Again, we would say, okay, who's making the statement and what is their purpose? What's the source of the information? Is there anything missing? Yes, there are people who enter this country with nefarious intent. Yes, people coming into this country are taxing our social services. But what is the degree of veracity in this statement? We can check the validity. I think that there are parts of this that are truer than others. Is this more of a point of view or verifiable fact? Might there be some other perspectives of equal valid on the topic?
Even if are some of the consequences of this coming not from the people themselves, but of poor policies and poor practices that we have as a country that are allowing this type of thing to occur. So blaming the people themselves for something, again, is a deceptive.
I think also it's a temptation to take really complicated topics and reduce them to a yes or no or black or white, and to get rid of the nuances. It's tricky. And let's look at another one.
Okay. I hear this sometimes. Don't pay attention to the news. It's just the news channels are only out to make money. They spin the stories just to grab your attention. You can't trust what they say to be accurate.
So, in fact, news outlets are trying to be profitable and try to sustain their viability. And here's a great chart that kind of lays them out. It says ratings based online in terms of what their leaning is. The L and the L, C and R stand for left. So the ones all the way to the left are left leaning. The one with the light blue is kind of moderately left, then centrist, right, and then far right. So I always told my students, get your information from a variety of sources. You're going to get a little different spin from all of these. The same news report can emphasize certain things, have an agenda, de-emphasize other things. You may only be hearing it from one side. Get your information from print. Get it from, get the headlines from one place, and then the content where they're going to really flesh it out. But just know when you're consuming these things that there are trends in terms of the way they're going to represent a topic. Okay, so and there are ways to check. There are equally also, on our next slide, there are sites that are dedicated to kind of ferreting out facts. I'm most familiar with Snopes, and these are certainly not the only organizations that do that. But as consumers, basically what we're doing is we're talking about being consumers of information. And just like we have consumer reports and agencies that go through detecting the quality of goods and services, we do have organizations out there that are trying to illuminate the quality of information.
So they're asking the questions and then going after the research to
and
find
they're
the
looking
answers.
at the history, and they're looking at the, sometimes you won't find things show up on these sources when it's brand new news. You may have to wait a while because they have to sift and sort through things.
So let's take another one here that sometimes we hear. With all this stuff happening with sexual identity these days, children raised in same-sex marriages, they're going to have identity issues when they get older.
So, if you're testing this, you would want to say, who is making this claim and what's their purpose? What's the source of information? If we look back at those, if your information came from one of those sources, then you could test it against, layer it against what their inclination is in general. And if we look at that question at the bottom of the screen here, why is this issue so important to me? We may have experiences that anchor us
Sort of
and
an
that predispose
internal bias.
us. Yes, and so we're going to be more inclined to believe something, and we might want to examine that. And when we're talking with other people in a civil way, we want to honor those things. Like, what is the anchoring experience that you had in your life that makes you inclined to believe this? And be listening to that, and then say, oh, well, I understand that given that happened to you, you would believe this. May I tell you that this is not my experience, and I'll share my anchoring experience, and then you can kind of compare these things and also do research. So basically, in closing, what we're asking folks to be aware of is that to have healthy relationships, interpersonal relationships, we need to be able to trust each other, but we also need to be able to respect different points of view. But you can be curious and say, well, help me understand why you believe that. Where did you get the information on that? To be a healthy society, healthy democracy, and to live together under the rules that we have established, we also need to be conscious consumers with critical thinking. Information comes to us and it doesn't have labels. It doesn't necessarily, except you know where the website was, or the television program, or the print came from. And you can read about that organization or about that source and see what their inclinations are. But we don't, if we're going to the hardware store, we can look at materials, or if we're buying clothes, we can examine them. We can look at the label, we can look at the content, and we know whether it's valuable and whether this is going to work for us. We don't have that transparency all the time on the information that we're being bombarded with.
We can't use our senses
Yeah.
with information that's coming to us online.
But we can, with a little bit of effort, do some research, and we can figure out what the content, what the ingredients, and what the targeted audience was, and just test it with some of these questions. And in terms of, and there are a lot of creative people who are out there, sadly, using their talents and their intellect for purposes that are not as positive for us. But with a little bit of effort, we can defend ourselves from disinformation and still maintain the quality of our interpersonal relationships. And we can also kind of be a buttress against turning disinformation into misinformation, and be less prone to just pass it on without being curious or kind of testing it against these critical thinking.
Through the questioning format, yeah.
So we appreciate you on this journey today as we tried to build our critical thinking muscles, and with questions and curiosity and civil dialogues and mutual respect. And we look forward to seeing you again on the Relationship Toolbox.